therapist's computer, and then are we admit all? So good evening, everybody. Everybody's coming in. We've got 124 participants who are online. So good evening and thank you very much for joining us so promptly. We have a lot to get through, so we'll just get started. I hope you're all well, that you've had a nice bank holiday since we last connected. And we're delighted that you are here with us this evening. I'd like to thank Eamon and Norma. They're back with us this evening after last week's presentation. We got a lot of feedback and thank you for all the questions. We got over 60 questions in on the sorts of things you'd like to see this evening. Now, I don't know if we're going to get all of them covered, but they have broken them into themes and they're going to try and address each of them. But thank you for those who have provided guidance, who've given us feedback, for joining us each evening, and the PSPs, as always, for keeping us on track in terms of where they feel we should be focusing our attention. So good evening again to Michael from Malta, and we have Patricia from Enniscrone. I'm going to get started with the presentation. We're learning as we go how you best like to see these evolve. So we've changed it a little bit again this evening. Oh my gosh, there's just so many windows open. 1 second. I can't see. Oh Lord. Sorry, I cannot see my thing. At least, yeah, that's okay. All right, so display settings. There we go. All right, so you're very welcome. Tonight, what we are going to do is a second half and a carry on from last week's webinar, where we had Dr. Eamon Keenan and Norma joining us for the information on how COVID was affecting people who use drugs. What we found from that is that there was a lot of information that we probably don't know about when it comes to the illicit drug market. So we're all very attuned to the quality assurance and the mechanisms of our legitimate drug market. And so we have Eamon and Norma here this evening to give us an insight. So tonight is the Wednesday the 3rd of June. That's when our webinar was recorded for anybody who is looking at it in retrospect. Now, what we normally do is we ask you to describe one word on menti.com and to use this code. We normally do it later on, but I'm actually going to get you to do this now. So basically all I'm asking you is, how are you? And you can do the emphasis whatever way you want. How are you? How are you? Or how are you? But basically, if you can do this, what we've ended up with is a word cloud that gives us just a sense check of how the profession is doing. And like I said before, we presented at the Pharmacy Contingency Planning Group every Wednesday morning. Last week was the first time we saw optimism, and a sense check during the week, and with our colleagues in the IPU and superintendents have said that yes, actually, not only are pharmacists feeling more optimistic, but the profession more generally and the public more generally are actually feeling more optimistic. So that isn't to be really, that isn't a surprise for any of us. So if you can tell us how you are, that would be great. And then let me just go through very quickly the domestics. So please turn your microphones off. Please leave your videos on if you can, but if you have connectivity issues, then turn them off. You should have no difficulty with sound, but contact us in the comment box if you do, and use that for questions or comments. Now, each of us are responsible for GDPR, so we have the webinar being recorded, and it'll be available on the IIOP website. And therefore, if you don't wish to disclose anything, please just make sure that you don't do that. So the format for this evening is the presentation and conversation, and then a discussion with the chat box. And as always, we aim to be finished by 9 o'clock. So I'm going to just launch the poll to see who do we have with us this evening. Now, I know some of you are also doing Menti, but I would like you to just take a moment to let us know which colleagues we have with us. It's always good to know who we have. Just take a minute while people are putting that in. Anybody looking at the recording, you're not going to necessarily see the poll, but you'll hopefully see it when I share it in a moment on the screen. Okay. So 117, 118 of you. I'll just give you another minute while you're doing that, and I'll keep just going to look and see what the Mentimeter is looking for like. Is there any problem, Alicia, with the Mentimeter? Is it okay?
No, the Mentimeter has worked fine for me anyway.
Perfect. Okay, so in terms of the poll, thank you. There's 124 of you, so I'll stop it there. And as usual, welcome to the majority of people who are our community colleagues, and then we've got 73% who are from community. We have 10 of our hospital colleagues, 3 from academia, industry and regulatory affairs. There's about, and administration, there's 10 or 11 of you, and we have others which are 10, no students with us this evening. So that's who we're all sharing the webinar with this evening. So you're welcome, every single one of you. I'm just going to go over to the word cloud. Oh dear, people are tired again. So we've only 52 people who've put in their word in Menti. So if you could, please, because we've got over 160 people on it. I know you may feel that this is a strange way to start a webinar, but it really does give us a good sense check of where people are at and helps us to tailor what we're doing. So the code, if you go to www.menti.com and use the code, that was there, so it's 50 59 29. And I'll just see how this is emerging. So 55 of you have voted, and I'm just going to share the screen so all of you can see how that's evolving. Now, there you go. Okay, so tired. We've got tired in the middle, but good. A bit overwhelmed. Optimistic is there, but not as prominent as it was last week. Busy, tired, and good. Okay, so at least we have tired and good. Okie dokie. Frustrated, very tired. Oh dear, whoever's very tired, thank you for making and Banjaxed, oh my gosh, thank you for making the efforts to join us. Drained, sad, exasperated. We've got some who are groovy, grateful, and feeling a bit better. Busy, I think we're all busy. Still tired, oh dear. Concerned. Okay, so never better. Fantastic to hear that some people are good. We've got some people who are hot. I don't know if that's heat or something else, but good to hear, I think. All right. Okay, so the 78 of you. So that's good to know. And like I say, we feed that back to the HSE in terms of how the profession is feeling and the sort of support. And there's some good conversations happening about how the work of the profession is being recognised at a central level in the health service and the department. It's very much accepted that there was a huge surge in pharmacists stepping up to the mark, and that's been very much appreciated. And really, the HSE, under the direction of Philip Crowley, are looking to see how we can establish a more strategic view of how we work with the pharmacy profession. Okay, so that's that. In terms, thank you very much for sharing that with us. So just to go back to the last word of introduction for our guest this evening, we have Eamon Keenan back with us and Norma Harnedy, and we're taking this as part 2, looking at the drug market and COVID-19, but this time looking maybe starting from a global issue and working down to Norma's presentation afterwards at a more local level. So Eamon, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to you, please. You're very welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just get my talk up. I'll go here. Okay, so people can see that okay?
Yeah.
So thanks very much for having me back again. And I'm going to talk about the drug market again and the issues that we've been facing and what we expect coming out of the recent lockdown. I'm going to repeat a couple of slides that you would have seen last week, but I'm going to maybe have a little bit more time just to go into some of the issues that are of interest. So I discussed last week how the global drug market for Europe is estimated to be worth 30 billion. 39% of that is for cannabis, 31% for cocaine, and 25% for heroin. And I suppose when you look at that, and when you look at the addiction services, it does strike you that a lot of our resources actually go into dealing with heroin, and not as many resources will go into dealing with cannabis. But the reality is it's a much bigger market, and many more people use it. The modes of transport, of course, of moving drugs around the world. This is taken from the United Nations information. And as you can see, for the opioids or for the heroin, the main mode of transport is by vehicle and land. And we discussed last week how the impacts of border closures and restrictions on travel impacted on that. For cocaine, the main transportation is via the sea. And that still continued during the crisis, because goods had to be moved around the world. And the ports of Antwerp and Rotterdam in Europe are the big ports where drugs access the European market. From the cannabis point of view, there's a combination of vehicle, land, and air transport, sea transport. And then for amphetamines, again, we mentioned last week that a lot of amphetamines are produced, amphetamine type drugs are produced in Europe, in the Netherlands, and they are transported by land. So all of these transportation methods were impacted to a varying degree during the COVID crisis. So we got a load of questions in afterwards, and so some people seem to be interested in the organized crime aspect of it, and obviously I'm not going to reveal too much around this particular topic, but it is drugs does represent a major source of income for organized crime, and you see that organized crime are becoming very innovative in relation to the production and trafficking, and even during the COVID crisis, as the health service introduced innovation, and we all started working in different ways, maybe using much more remote access, remote counseling. So also the drug market introduced innovation, and they started looking at different ways to be able to move the drugs around Europe and around the world. And so I think it's fair to say that other routes opened up, and so for example the heroin route around the Horn of Africa opened up much more than had been previously used. The result of the global market is it means that consumers have access to cheaper but higher potency drugs, and of course that's the concern, particularly when one considers the harms associated from a mental health point of view and from a physical health point of view. The more potent the drug, the more harms that you're going to get with it, but yet more and more people are looking for the bigger hit or the higher purity. This is seen as better. So while Europe is a destination for heroin and cocaine, we are a major producer of cannabis and the synthetic drugs, and we are actually the global supplier of Mdma. A lot of Mdma factories in the Netherlands, and they tend to ship, as we were mentioning last week, there were 100 kilograms of Mdma seized in the post office in the Netherlands as it was being transported around the world, and very often you see pictures of these Mdma factories which have been abandoned in the Netherlands. So because of this increase in drug availability and organized criminal gang, there's a big increase in violence and corruption across Europe. We talked about the corruption involved with customs officials, and I'm going to mention a little bit more about that in a minute. And violence. We're all aware of violence that is being reported on a regular basis in the media associated with the drug trade. Some people asked about the specific organization of crime in relation to drugs in Ireland. And so just to let you know, we did feature in the most recent European drug market report, and it talked about a three-tier hierarchy in Ireland for drug distribution. So you have a lower tier, which would be generally young people, and they're involved in sort of intimidation, bullying, vandalism, and generally creating mayhem or difficulty in local areas. Then you have a second tier, which would be a slightly older cohort who are involved in more of the high risk activities. So that's in relation to the selling drugs, in relation to moving drugs around the place, in relation to guns. And there's high rewards for those young people in that regard, and they get paid well by the higher tier, the upper tier, which is often, it may be kinship is what they call it, familial based. So those three tiers or hierarchy of drug distribution are involved in Ireland, and it's recognized across Europe. So we talked about the corruption, and just to talk about smuggling. And we mentioned the fact that in Rotterdam, in Antwerp actually, corrupt officials can be offered between 75,000 and 125,000 euro to facilitate drugs coming in. So this is one of the ways. So this is called the switch, which is a slight variation on the, putting drugs on to a container in Bogota and taking it off in Antwerp. So this is which where it involves corruption on both sides. So on the side, in the South American side, somebody puts the package in an accessible part of the container. That comes and it arrives in Antwerp, and then before it reaches customs, it's accessed, and the individual takes the package out and puts it into, for example, an EU container, which isn't going to be subject to a customs inspection because there's free travel throughout Europe. And so that switch is a common way that corruption and drugs are moved in. Another way then would be within the container, and the container itself is changed, and that there are areas within the container where, such as cooling compartments or insulation materials within the walls and floorings, that individuals can place the drugs in and then retrieved at the far end. There's also other ways that it's transported by sea. You've got a drop off from commercial shipping. So you've got a large tanker or liner going along, and at some point it drops off a package, which is then picked up by a much smaller vessel. And we would have seen reports of that in Ireland or on the coasts around Ireland in the past. And then there's pleasure vehicles or large yachts, large boats, which would be subject to much less stringent checks. So those are some of the ways in which the drugs are transported by sea. In relation to the air transportation, there's 4 different types of transportation. So there's, first of all, white flights, which are normal flights, and these operate under normal aviation protocols. And yet the drugs are continued to be smuggled in those. And then there are the grey flights, which are apparently operating under normal aviation protocols, but will stop off for an unscheduled stop. So maybe stopping off at a small airfield on its way to Europe to either pick up or drop off drugs. And then the grey flight can also sometimes drop off the drugs at smaller airfields in Europe. Then there are the black flights. So these are the very clandestine. These aren't reported. They're not operating under aviation protocols. And they fly at low altitude with using radio silence with the transponder off. And generally these ones coming into Europe are coming from West Africa. And then finally there's the unmanned flights, the UAVs or the drones, which are becoming more popular. So this, you saw this slide last week, and it just gives you the different types of aircraft. You've got them from Central and South America and the Caribbean and from West Africa, but you've also got if you look over on the right-hand side, the Western Balkan route. So as I said to you, when drugs are coming in from Afghanistan, when heroin is coming in from Afghanistan, it goes up the Balkan route. But this is a Western route where it's transported by plane or light aircraft into Italy and then through the rest of Europe. So we'll just talk about the cannabis market to start with. Again, this is usually a local market or sourced from North Africa. The EU reports would be that there's almost 25 million people using cannabis in the last year in the adult age group. 17.5 of these were young adults. 17.5 million of these were young adults in the 15 to 34 age group. From our Irish figures, and the last prevalence data we have was from 2014 or 2015, 7.7% of adults had used in the last year, but that rises to 13.8% amongst young adults in that 15 to 34-year-old age group. So it's a significant issue in this country. Our most we've recently completed another prevalence survey, and the results of that will be out hopefully either later this year or early next year. It's also important to note that so last year use, not everybody who uses in the last year would be considered dependent on cannabis or at that level. However, some of the data that we've been looking at from that last prevalence survey showed that up to 20% of young people were displaying symptoms of dependence, which is a real concern for treatment services. So the trends here in relation to cannabis, you've got herbal cannabis and you've got resin, cannabis resin. And what we're seeing in relation to both is that the potency has been increasing over the last 10 years. The price has not increased to the same extent. So you're really getting more potent cannabis now for only slightly, significantly more potent cannabis for only slightly increase in price. And there's a question last week that came into the chat room in relation to the risk of schizophrenia or mental health problems. And I just direct you to a couple of recent studies, one by Robin Murray in 2016 in World Psychiatry, and another one by Marta DeForte in 2019 in the Lancet. And they've done very elegant studies looking at prevalence rates of psychosis right across Europe and linking it in with an increase in cannabis use across Europe. And what they've identified is that in those cities where the cannabis potency is higher, and that's in particular in Amsterdam and in London, there was a higher rate of psychosis amongst young people. So it's not necessarily to say that all cannabis causes psychosis, but there's definitely an element that it contributes to the development of psychosis. And of course, it's one component that is preventable. And that's what Marta DeForte is really saying at the minute, is that this rise in psychosis amongst young people is maybe multifactorial, but there's one component of that which is preventable, and that would be around the high potency or the access to the high potency cannabis. So moving on to the heroin or the opioid European market, as I said to you last week, heroin is grown in Afghanistan and transported into Europe by the Balkan route. We would have about 1.3 million high-risk users in Europe. And in Ireland, in the last prevalence survey, we had 18,988 people identified as being opioid dependent. Now, I'll just point out that people are aware of our OST figures, number of people on methadone maintenance or on Suboxone treatment, and it's over 11,000 at this point. So we have now been able to access significant numbers of people who are using opioids in this country into opioid replacement treatment therapy, and that's really good, and it's really comparable with any of the services in Europe in terms of reaching into the population. What we are seeing now is the emergence of the synthetic opioids, and of course that's a big concern. And coming into COVID, that's a big concern for us, and I would have had many discussions with people about this, in that our concern was that this would be an opportunity where synthetic opioids would become a problem. And we've seen what's happened in North America, in the United States and Canada in relation to the opioid epidemic, which is a national emergency over there, and that's being driven by the synthetic opioids. Just heroin production. So as I said, Afghanistan, and you can see from this slide is that the vast majority of heroin produced across the world is coming from Afghanistan. Myanmar is the next biggest producer of heroin. And that becomes interesting as well, because as I said to you last week, the cultivation of heroin in Afghanistan is March to June, and that was interfered with. We're not sure yet how much that is. That was interfered with. But Myanmar cultivation is from January to March, so they may well have been able to cultivate their heroin, and that might have an impact on the market. So the synthetic opioids are a real concern, as I say. You can see from really 2015, we started to get an increase in the number of seizures, both of powder and tablet synthetic opioids. And year on year, we're seeing an increase in the number of new opioids identified for the first time in the EU. And you can see there the table in the bottom right-hand corner, the carfentanil, the seizures of carfentanil. And just to put that in context, carfentanil would be estimated to be about 600 times more powerful than an equivalent size of heroin. So this is what's been driving a lot of the overdose deaths in North America, these very high potency fentanyl derivatives. And just for the nerds amongst you, in relation to carfentanil, for those of you who've been watching Jurassic World, at one point when they were looking to to take down one of the velociraptors, Chris Pine asked for the carfentanil as the drug of choice to take down a velociraptor. So that's just, I got very excited when I heard that on the Jurassic World. But anyway, that's beside the point. The cocaine market then, so we have 4 million users in the last year has been identified in Europe. And again, if you look at the young adult group, 2.6 million users. What we were seeing in Ireland before the COVID crisis hit, was that we were seeing increasing rates, and I've got a couple of slides about that in a few minutes. The rates in Ireland would show 2.9% of young adults had used in the last year. That's a significant amount. The slide on the right shows the trafficking hubs, or the main EU user markets. So the trafficking hubs in Spain, Portugal, France, Netherlands, and Belgium. So in relation to our own figures for cocaine, we've been seeing a year-on-year rise in relation to the number of people presenting for cocaine treatment. And in 2018, the most recent figures we have available, there were over 2,000 cases, 80% male, slightly older age group, 30 years. But one of the things to note is that 35% of them were employed. And the majority of people that we traditionally would have been seeing, if we look at our broader cohort of people attending for services, only about 17% of those would be employed. So this is a different cohort of people who are using cocaine. And this is the year-on-year increase that we've been seeing, both in new cases and in repeat cases coming back to us for cocaine. Now, if you remember, during the Celtic Tiger, cocaine was very popular. There were lots of presentations for treatment. That dropped off significantly, and it started picking up again from about 2012 as our own economy started to pick off. So what will be interesting now, and I think we heard a lot of talk in the media before COVID about a tsunami of cocaine hitting the country, and you can't go to any pub in Ireland without being offered cocaine. It will be interesting to see if there's an economic recession, how that will impact on the cocaine market. What we have seen since the lockdown is that the recreational market for cocaine isn't there, so some more cocaine has been available on the streets. So we've had COVID, we've had shipping transportation has continued or increased in some cases. Air transportation virtually eliminated, road transportation reduced. We've had an increase in postal, social media, and internet delivery. Our internet, I did say it here, internet, the cultivation of heroin in Afghanistan may have been interrupted, whereas the Myanmar heroin cultivation may have gone ahead as planned. So from our own point of view, we've had reports that the strength of heroin has reduced in Dublin. And we've also had reports of a reduced level of opioid overdose. Now, sometimes it's difficult to say that for certain, as coroner reports will take a while to come through, but talking to people working on the ground, we seem to be less opioid overdoses. The recreational use of the stimulant drugs, such as cocaine, is reduced. Cannabis use continues, but may be less available. And then we've seen these benzodiazepines and the new benzodiazepines emerge, and we're wondering now whether some of these have been pressed in Ireland. The seizure of drugs has continued throughout lockdown in Ireland and abroad. And this is a picture, again, for the United Nations in relation to seizure of opioids that were reported between February and April 2020, right around coming from the Afghanistan region. Not many seizures, as you'll see there, in Afghanistan itself, but outside Afghanistan, significant seizures. One seizure is worth mentioning. This was in Myanmar. So this was, I think, the largest seizure ever in Southeast Asia. And that picture is just mind-boggling to think that that's the drugs which are being produced in some of these illicit factories. There was an unprecedented level of seizures of the opioid precursors. 200 million methamphetamine tablets, 500 kilograms of crystal methamphetamine, 300 kilograms of heroin, and 3,750 liters of methylfentanyl. Again, a much stronger opioid than heroin. In terms of our own seizures, we have been seeing regular seizures throughout the lockdown, and in March and April, over 4 million seizures happened, large seizure of cocaine. And in May, we've had another over 2 million seized, up to, I think that's about up to the 25th of May. So seizures have continued during the lockdown, and perhaps it's in relation to the visibility of people who are traveling around and bringing drugs. Wanted to mention the new psychoactive substances, because these are the area of interest. The EMCDDA, the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction, keeps records in relation to all new substances notified. They're now monitoring 731 new substances that have been notified. And this graph shows an increase up to a peak in 2014, which has fallen down a little bit, but increased again in 2018. So this includes 49 synthetic opioids and 28 of the new benzodiazepines. So these new drugs are being produced all the time. And in fact, we just had a notification this week from the early warnings in the European Monitoring Centre of a new opioid, which was identified in Poland. The new benzodiazepines, so we've had significant seizures during the lockdown, but we have had overdoses associated with polydrug use, including these benzodiazepines. So that's a picture on the right-hand side of a press that's used to make the homemade tablets. And down below, the picture down below is one tablet that was analysed in the National Drug Treatment Centre by Siobhan Stokes and her team there. That was being sold on the street as D10, as the diazepam. And the analysis identified that contained alprazolam, adazolam, tizolam, and some other contaminants, perhaps Mdma, but no diazepam. So it shows you that these tablets, these are the new benzodiazepines which are being sold on the streets as D10. And last week I would have showed you the extent to which people are going to produce authentic-looking drugs. And you've heard about the Xanax sticks, which are all also in this category. Just wanted to talk very briefly about some research that we did last summer in relation to drugs. We looked at the population of young people and the population who may not be represented adequately in our regular prevalence surveys, in our general population surveys. So we're looking at clubbers, festival attendees. And this was a collaboration we did with the HSE and the Trinity College Dublin. We did a survey. It was online. We promoted it heavily through social media and our own website, drugs.ie. And this was the first of its kind in an Irish context. And what we really wanted to do was get insights and attitudes towards drug use amongst this population to inform harm reduction measures. We had almost 1,200 participants, male, female, as you can see, split fairly evenly, 52% employed and about 40% students, average age 24. So as I say, almost 1,200 respondents, almost all of them would report alcohol use. Polydrug use was common, 87%. Mdma and ecstasy, followed by cannabis, were the most popular drugs. And it was interesting, MDMA powder was used by the young people. And their perception was that the powder was more pure than the tablets. And we're wondering, you know, we've had a lot of harm reduction messages going out about what's in the pill, be careful of tablets, make sure you don't take a full tablet, take half a tablet. And we're wondering now, has that made people think that maybe the powder is more pure somehow than the tablets? And of course, that's nonsense. One of the popular mixtures, just so you're aware of it, is cocaine and ketamine. It's called CK or Calvin Klein, and that's popular. And in the media recently, you've heard talk about nitrous oxide. It's not something which has emerged during the COVID crisis. This has been around for some time. We've been following and tracking this for about 18 months now. And this population identified that over a quarter of them had used nitrous oxide. Really interesting point was that 10% of them, and so that's out of almost 1,200 people, said they took something and they didn't know what it was. They took it at a party, they took it at a festival, they were just given to it, they had no idea what it was. So, you know, we're using this information to reach people who don't really present to our traditional services. Online is how you get access to this population, and I think we're learning that more during this crisis, is that the online platform is really important to use. We collaborate, and some of the pictures there are collaborations with the Union of Students, event organizers, and we've had information stands in the past at third level institutions. We're working with festivals to look at harm reduction licenses and strategies, so that we're going to have, as part of a license to produce, to hold a festival, you should be having harm reduction messaging targeting young people who are attending that in relation to the harms associated with drug use. But also the reality being people are taking drugs at these festivals, and our messages are harm reduction. In other words, don't take the drugs. It's much safer if you don't take them. However, if you do take them, here's what you should know. Let your friends know that you're taking the drugs. Don't be afraid to go to the medics. Take a quarter of a tablet. Wait 2 hours between taking more, because some of these are slow release. You can see all the effort which is going into producing these tablets. Some of them are now slow release. So I know Norma is going to talk a little bit about testing, but drug checking is one area that we are looking at in a working group that's been set up to look at one of the actions within the national strategy. And we had been hoping to have something, you know, to consider for this festival season, but that's obviously gone. So we'll be looking at 2021. And a number of places throughout Europe, drug checking takes place at festivals, whereby drugs are handed in, analysed on site, and if something untoward is identified, that message goes around the festival, using social media, using the festival organisers. At these festivals, you have screens up on either side of the stage, and you can put up harm reduction. Really worked really well last year at a Boomtown Festival in the UK, where they identified PMA in a tablet which was sold as MDMA, and they were able to say, don't take these orange tablets. They will put the pictures up on social media. This contains potentially lethal PMA. So they couldn't, the drug dealers couldn't sell the tablets anymore, so they started crushing it and selling it as powder. But they were able to say the orange powder is just the tablet crushed up. And these messages all went up. And so this was a real live example of how the drug checking impacted on the use of drugs at a festival. And people do listen to the messages that you put out, particularly if you do it with some authority. And the fact that you've taken the sample, you've analysed it, and this is what was found, and people will change their behaviour on that basis. So that's sort of a brief overview of what I wanted to say. We have our Twitter is at drugs.ie, at HSE Live. We have our Facebook, and our website I direct you all towards is www.drugs.ie. It's Nikki Killeen does tremendous work in relation to this, herself and Nicola Corrigan working with me. Both make sure that website is up to date and has relevant information. It's also where you can get information in relation to accessing drug and alcohol services across the country. So I think I'll stop there, and I'll pass back to yourself, Katrina.
Okay, thank you very much, Eamon. That is a very insightful and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you. I know many of the questions that have come in the last couple of comments have been around, well, I suppose a couple of things, codeine and tramadol. So one question is tramadol being used or misused, or is it being used as a potential gateway, because there's a lot of it being prescribed in vulnerable, elderly and young people. Any insight into that, Eamon?
We did see tramadol being abused before Christmas, and we sent out an advisory note to services around a combination of tramadol and alprazolam being sold in the Xanax sticks, specifically, and they were analysed. So that particular area is one that we're aware of. We sent pictures out, and those pictures are up on our website of the tablets to be wary of. I think Norma's going to talk a little bit about the codeine presentations in community pharmacies, so she might cover some of that also.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end, but thank you, Eamon. And Norma, can I hand over to you then to share your screen and bring us through the next part of the presentation, please?
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you, Eamon, for that really interesting presentation. So I'm just going to bring up my presentation here. There we go. Share. Okay. So thank you, everybody, for joining us again. I'm going to try and answer some of your questions. As we mentioned, there's over 60 of them. So it'll be a bit of a mishmash of information, but I'll try and let it kind of flow and see how we get on, covering some of the information that you wanted to know tonight. So leading on from Eamon's presentation, the first kind of theme that I wanted to cover is the theme of forgeries, because that's one that came up quite a bit in your questions. So it's really going back to basics. You know, there's only so much we can do, and what we do is try and harness onto those pieces of legislation and so on that we have that we can work with. So this is some advice from the Psi Guidance issued in 2012, and just kind of step by step what to do, a bit of common sense that you know that the script is from a G that you know of. If you're not sure, to check that it is real. If you suspect it is a false script, then to contact the guards, and then also the HSC primary care pharmacist who may, in your area, who may issue a cascade warning, depending, I suppose, on how real or how serious the forgery is. You could have a discussion about that, and maybe locally, especially maybe the weekend or evening setting, that might want to contact the local pharmacies in the area if the person doesn't leave. Sometimes you might not be in a position to actually keep the script because that would cause too much hassle in your pharmacy, so you might let them walk out with it, but let the other pharmacies in the area know that it's on the way. Just to mention as well, some people bought in about methadone scripts or controlled drug scripts altered. The clients sometimes don't realise, perhaps because it's their own prescription that they've got from their doctor, that amending a script, whether to add on that they need more takeaways of that, is actually a crime, and that this is taken very, very seriously by the clinic. And it can sometimes be, or by the GP, it can sometimes be very hard to spot. But if you see somebody who's been on daily doses forever, suddenly change to getting a week of takeaways, there's something that should set the alarm bells ringing. Give the doctor a ring to check, is that the case? Now, it's a little bit different now with COVID, because many patients are on a lot less than daily supervision. But if you're unhappy, and I'll touch on a bit of this later, if you're unhappy with that lack of supervision, definitely let the GP or the clinic know that you're unhappy with that. So another common theme that we have is over-the-counter codeine seeking. So just to highlight there, the PSI guidance for pharmacists that was brought out last year, which is a lot about the safe storage and keeping out of the sight of the public and that. But there's also a little bit about what to do if you're pretty sure that there is misuse happening. So it has to be done in a very sensitive manner. But the options are for the patient to speak to their GP, which mightn't be an option if they don't want to disclose their GP or they don't have one. Or they may feel that they will be somehow prosecuted or be in trouble if they contact their local addiction service, but it is an assessment can be done at a drop-in clinic by either a nurse or an outreach worker, which is totally anonymous and private. They don't contact anybody unless there are serious very serious considerations, such maybe suicide, ideation, or children at risk. But it is private, and they will make an assessment of whether counselling would be enough support, or whether they'd need a full move on to complementary opiate substitution medication as well. It's interesting the impact of COVID on codeine addiction. I've heard reports from clinics where patients have presented, and they have, this is before COVID, they have full diaries of where they got their codeine last, that they got it last Tuesday there, last Wednesday there, last Thursday there, so they know not to go back there for about another 3 or 4 weeks. So they shop all over a city. They even know the rota of some of the locums, who's on a Saturday every second week, and that they also locum in another shop across town. So don't show your face there that particular time. An enormous amount of work and effort that goes into that, and often these patients present in intensive care or A&E with a bleeding ulcer or renal failure, needing dialysis, that before they really seek help. So we're trying to get them in, and it would be very useful from a pharmacy perspective if it can be done sensitively, that patients know that option there of seeking help can be done an awful lot earlier. Suboxone is often used for substitution treatment because it is a less potent opiate, and also there tends to be not as much polydrug use with codeine users, so it's more, they fit the criteria better for Suboxone treatment. So then you need to be knowledgeable, I suppose, of those who come into you, of what, if you suspect that there's abuse of any level, a young, old, or those who don't even know that they have an addiction problem. Maybe seeking their medication early, that kind of thing, where to send them. And I think it's good to have a look and see what's in your local area. And the first port of call might be to phone the drugs HIV helpline. Sorry, that's what it used to be called. It's now called the drugs and alcohol helpline. And they're very good there. They go through what the needs of the patient would be. So the patient themselves would phone, or even their family member, if there's appropriate, phone and find out what the needs of the patient might be, where they should go, whether they should get counselling, or whether they should get speak to an outreach counsellor, for example, or an outreach worker, for example. If there's somebody who's a poor injecting technique, they might have no interest in counselling, no interest in starting treatment, but they might want to get in touch with somebody who could guide them how to inject properly. So it's good to know what's in your area. You look at the drugs.ie under services, you can click on your area and spend a bit of time looking, because the description of the services is quite, there's quite a lot of them, and it might be just to take a little bit of time to know exactly which one a patient could go to. If you knew one for opiate substitution screening, and knew that in your area, then that would be very helpful. And if you have any difficulty with any of that, you can contact your local liaison pharmacist for assistance with that. So the next two areas I'm going to briefly talk about are pregabalin and benzodiazepines. So this is a guidance for prescribers that was produced by the Medicines Management Programme in last year. Just a couple of bits to highlight. It's very interesting to read, but it does highlight, the potential for misuse, abuse, and dependence, potential for diversion, and then the withdrawal symptoms. And the withdrawal, the tapering dose here is recommended for somebody who's not addicted, and for any of the indications for the product, is to stop by over the course of a week. So that is vastly different from what Public Health England did some work, 2014, I think it was, yeah. And they recommended to reduce by 50 to 100 milligrams every week. So that's a big difference. And maybe perhaps discussing that with the patient, that it needs to be done very carefully. And maybe to go to, if you have a good understanding of what the patient's going through, pregabalin is used to give a feeling of kind of euphoria, relaxation, calm, very nice feelings, and if that's taken away, then it can bring on very unpleasant feelings. So it has to be taken away very gradually from the patient. It can be done with their GP, but they may be sourcing it from other family members and so on. And an interesting fact, and slightly morbid fact, is there's a very high value for pregabalin in the prison population. Some are, especially the UK, come down from the UK, they've been patients reported taking up to 800 milligram 4 times a day. which is also reported in the public health document there, as well as people taking up to 5 grams of pregabalin at a time. So that has huge implications in terms of overdose and respiratory depression. The other medicines management program that they have put out a fact sheet on benzodiazepines, again worth reading. A proper benzodiazepine detox would be being down by about 2 milligrams of diazepam every week or so. It might take up to 10 months or a year. People talk about taking fist loads of tablets, and we talked last week a little bit about Xanax. So it's short-acting benzodiazepines, and a short-acting benzodiazepine is going to cause withdrawal very quickly, within the next day, whereas a long-acting one, the full effects of withdrawal mightn't be felt for a couple of weeks. So the idea is to switch everybody who wants to change to try and stop to long-acting diazepam. It's much more gradual withdrawal syndrome. So you might, for somebody just to note, somebody might come in on 10 milligrams of diazepam 3 times a day. You might think that's a massive amount, but actually that might be a massive reduction, and that's as far as that they can manage. And to do that under the prescriber's care is a much, much better option than taking street benzos that they don't know what's on board. So another issue that I touched on last week was those who are struggling with COVID to do maintaining their methadone. That came up again in the questions. Just to say, to refer them back to GP if you think they're struggling with their supervision, or do they need extra support from counsellors or the outreach team in the clinic to get them through COVID. It's difficult for everybody, particularly difficult for this cohort. There is support offered at the clinic level in terms of how to develop skills to move away from all the temptations out there that Eamon mentioned, in terms of the drugs are really easily available in every street corner in every town. A little bit different at the moment because of transport issues, but you need to develop your skills set to avoid them and be quite determined. There are drugs out there for all of us to get to, but we manage to avoid them. But the other side of it too is we don't have maybe the need to use, so that's a different drive. So it's just, they will work through the cause of using, and also how to avoid using, and strategies to avoid it and to keep yourself good well-being. That is all covered in a lot of the counselling. So just antisocial behavior came up quite a lot in terms of methadone patients and that's something I work with a lot every day. It's not acceptable in the pharmacy. Most pharmacies would have maybe one poor, put up with one level of poor behavior, and then that's the patient gone. And I think that's fair enough. There is some pharmacy contracts there, which can serve their purpose in terms of they can be a little bit undignified for patients who are never going to cause any trouble. So you need to be careful in how you present these, that there is a balanced approach to the patient's care, but also if somebody is beginning to show signs of trouble, that a contract is bought out and shown that this is, I suppose, a tool to help them to stay on track, and that they realise the boundaries within the pharmacy and in a way kind of protects their place. And I'm talking specifically here because I work with the pharmacies outside of Dublin, and in Dublin, if somebody isn't doing too well, they can go back into a dispensing clinic, but that's not the case in outside the Pale, really, outside of Dublin, Wicklow and Kildare. So you have to be really protective of that place in the pharmacy. The influence of street benzos and alcohol, it really does have a major impact in the pharmacies and social behaviour, and patients who might be doing very well and then suddenly get a windfall of some benzodiazepines, or just get an urge to have some, and can do some really bad damage in the pharmacy, feel very remorseful and embarrassed and guilty afterwards, but really the damage is done. So there really is a big impact there, negative impact in the pharmacy, but we try to cope with that as much as possible and teach the clients their skills of avoiding that situation. Even to the point, if somebody really has difficulty with alcohol, to try and advise them to go in earlier in the day, so that at least that aspect of their lives isn't quite to the fore early in the morning, and their dose of OST should hopefully help them feel a bit more balanced and in control, that hopefully they won't drink as much. some queries come in then about needle exchange, and I suppose it seems obvious. One suggestion was, why don't you connect up the people who use needle exchange straight into therapy? But that's like saying, why don't you get every unfit person in the country into a gym and get them to start training? So everybody has to be ready, and they have to be at the right place. So they need to be shown the options. They need to be offered the advice when they want to hear it, and that needs a little bit of building up of a relationship, building up a bit of trust. And then, you know, when you feel they're ready to hear a little bit about what you say, they'll listen, but there's no point in saying it if they're not interested. The needle exchange does allow the relationship between the pharmacists to build up, but then you're left with the ethical dilemma of needle exchange and OST provision within the same 10 minutes. So that's something we often discuss at the training to do with through the IIOP training, and also on a daily basis with pharmacists throughout the country. So please give me a call if you're stuck with that or feeling, you know, finding it difficult. Eamon touched a little bit about the unknown drugs and how do people manage taking what they don't know. One, often they don't care when they're in I suppose a run of it, they just want to take whatever's available. But we do try and encourage as much as possible. This is for those in deep addiction, not those who are the occasional user, might be more careful, but just to take test dose for advice. And sometimes the dealers are a little bit careful as well. They don't want to get, you know, their customers, I suppose, overdosing. So usually people try and stay with the same dealer who kind of has an idea what level they're introducing to their client base, so that they don't end up losing that client base. Some other questions that come up was about the social aspects, again, in terms of, you know, what to do with crime, antisocial behavior, and that. These are really not specific to this patient cohort in terms of those who come in for prescriptions and that. So it's just a general rules apply. I wouldn't expect any extra favors to be done for this patient group. It's not fair in a pharmacy to put up with shoplifting, to put up with antisocial behavior and that. So, you know, that your usual, you're an independent pharmacy group, they know that's your own kind of stance on that is what applies. Any children concerned, the TUSLA have children for safety first, and as a healthcare professional, you will be obliged to let them know about some issues to do with children if you have concerns. Now, your role there would be to, as far as I'm aware, is to notify. It's not to manage the situation. So if you see it repeating or happening again, you've notified, you've let them know, and they may be handling it in a different way than you would expect. So I suppose if you're concerned, you could reiterate your concerns, but they have I suppose a certain pattern or certain management protocols for events and reports, just to ease your fears on that one. So just a little bit about decriminalization. I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I'll try and explain a little bit about this. This is a very good video on the European Medicines Centre for Drug and Drug Addiction
just
website.
To flag to you, Norma, we're probably about 2 or 3 minutes left to go, so okay. Just to flag that to you.
Okay, so basically decriminalization is sorry, lost the flow there. So this is really going from a change in criminal status. So change from being a criminal offence over to something that's they'll overlook. It's still a criminal offence, but they make it minor or they won't prosecute. Decriminalization means that they might still see it as an offence, but it'll be a non-criminal offence. So it might be a fine, like similar to a parking ticket, that still gets a punishment, but it's not seen as criminal. Then you switch over to the legal side of things, where, for example, alcohol is a legal drug, but it has some regulations attached to it. And then there's a free market, like the selling of coffee. So if in countries where things are a little bit more relaxed in terms of decriminalization of drugs, it's not that they are let everything, you know, free and take what you want. It's just different use of legislation. So just to end on that, the penalties at a glance, this is a tool within the EMC DDA website. In Ireland, you have, for example, you click on drug use and it'll come up what the punishment for this offence is. So the only one in Ireland you get punishment for drug use is for opium use. Then if you pick, say, for example, in a lot of countries, about half of countries in Europe, for drug use, it's actually treated as a healthcare issue. And Eamon is going to say a little bit about that there now. But that is not treated so much, as something that's punishable. Whereas supply, for example, in Portugal, have kind of led the way in terms of their approach to treatment of those who are in addiction. But it's supply. If you were a dealer or in supplying, then they come down really, really hard in that side of things. It's not that they've gone soft on that end of it. Just to finally say then a little bit about identification. If somebody comes in with a drug and they want to know what it is, be careful in terms of this is a mother trying to find out what her 18-year-old son is on. The drug could be something like sertraline. He didn't tell her that he was taking antidepressants. Just need to be careful with that. The NMIC can identify some drugs, but whether that's something you need to just advise her where she could go herself, or let the child themselves inform whoever it is, but that's where you can get some information on it. But again, identification of a drug is only one part of the picture. It's the whole support and where do you go from there that needs to be backed up. So I'll just let Eamon finish there on the piece to do with support for those who are caught using drugs, I suppose.
Thanks, Norma. So that's great. Yeah, the decriminalization, legalization is a sort of controversial area, and I don't think we have enough time really to explore it in any great depth, but that there is a working group at the minute ongoing between the Department of Health, Department of Justice, ourselves in the HSE and the Gardaí, looking at a health-based approach to somebody who's caught in possession of drugs for personal use, which would mean that in the first instance, somebody who's caught by a guard with drugs for personal use would be referred for a health intervention, a health assessment, health screening. On the second occasion, they would get a warning, and it wouldn't be until the third occasion that they came in contact with the police that they would be faced with any conviction. So it's a move towards a health-led response to possession of drugs.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much to both, to Eamon and to Norma. I think you'll agree that that was a very interesting whistle-stop tour of the illicit drugs market. Many of the questions that came up in the text box have already been answered, and we are just up against our time. So there's just one final thing that I'm seeking your advice on, and I'm going to launch a poll. Many people have asked, the Institute is interested to know how often you want to see us doing these. Hang on, I'm just going to continue, relaunch poll. I didn't want your area of practice, sorry. So basically what we're looking for, I'll end that polling. I'll go to your second question, there it is, sorry. So this is our question to you. Apologies for the waffling there. How often should these webinars take place? We're going to ask this week and next week. So we've been doing them weekly. And I've met some of you who said, oh yeah, weekly's fine, but not really sure that's going to be a lot. I don't know if I want to do it every Wednesday. We could do fortnightly, we could do monthly, or we could take a break for the summer. So we want to hear your views on that, please. So there's 74 of you are telling us, there's 160 in the room, so I'm just going to wait a little bit longer. It does look like, as we suspected, people may prefer to go fortnightly, and I wouldn't be surprised by that. Now 61 of you have said it. Just waiting for, if I can get another 10 or 20 of you to vote, we'll probably have most of the group. At 130, so that's good to know. It looks like it will go, that the preference is for fortnightly. We are going to have a webinar next week, so there's I'm going to stop the poll. There's 136 of you who've actually voted, and this is what you voted for. You've said the majority, 79 of you, said you'd rather it fortnightly. So we'll take that on board. We'll proceed with next week's, and then we will I suggest go to Fortnightly, listening to what you've just said to us there. So next week's presentation is going to be moving away from the clinical area, and we're going to be looking at flattening the stress curve. So Dr. Abby Lane, who's a consultant psychiatrist, will be with us, same time, same bat channel and all the rest, 8 p.m. On Wednesday the 10th of June. So we'd love you to join us there. Again, reflection, if you can tell us, not tell us, if you think about the impact this might have on your practice or how you deal with any of your patients, please let us know. We've also asked you for feedback every week. Now, we appreciate you're all very busy. You've been here on a Wednesday evening. And maybe when you get an email from us, maybe it's not quite the top of your priority list that day. So if you'd like to, there is I think Alicia is going to just now give us the link in her
yeah, that's shared to the chat box there, Katrina.
In the chat box, perfect. So there's a link there if you want to just do it before you head off, or even for the few minutes while we're here. As normal, okay, we've gone a few minutes over. I apologize for that, but thank you to everybody for sharing your time with us this evening. I think you'll agree that was a most interesting presentation, and most especially thank you to Dr. Eamon Keenan and to Norma Harnedy. It is wonderful to know that we have professionals like you working in our addiction services, and I know that there was a great recognition of your work this morning by Philip Crowley and the quality team, and in the health service in general, to say that you've done a tremendous job at a difficult time with this vulnerable group of people. And so too pharmacists community pharmacists have really stepped up to the mark in playing their part. So well done to everybody involved. So thank you for that. We'll stick around for a few minutes, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, if anybody wants to ask any questions specifically while we have our two experts with us, or even just to say anything that you want, really. And other than that, I'll bid you good night, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. We'll see you next Wednesday. And then we will take a break for a week and we'll go to Fortnightly. We'll be asking you what sort of topics you want, so please make sure you let us know. Okay, thank you very much and have a good evening. Now, if anybody wants to ask a specific question, is there any question there, Alicia, that you feel should be covered?
No, I do feel most of the questions have actually been covered in the content, unless there's any other questions that anybody wants to put in.
Well, I saw one there from Keith, and I don't know, Norma or Eamon, if you've seen the Netflix documentary, The Pharmacist. Neither of you have you,
No.
Eamon? Oh
No,
my
I haven't seen
gosh.
it yet.
So they wanted to know what you thought of it. Oh gosh, this is where now, last week I didn't have a clue what you were talking about with all your various different gangster films, but this is a documentary on Netflix called The Pharmacist, about a pharmacist in America who basically uncovered a huge issue with narcotics. And somebody else on the I'm not very good at explaining films, but it's a 4-part series, real life, and really, really good. Have you seen it, Alicia?
I haven't actually seen it. It's on my list of things to see, but no, I haven't got around to that one yet.
Sarah, if she's on, Sarah definitely saw it. She recommended it to me. Sarah Chambers, are you still on?
Good.
No, maybe she's not. It's a bit unfair to just put her on there. So anybody else has seen it? I thought it was really interesting. I do think that the pharmacist was on a bit of a mission, but yeah, it gave a huge insight into the narcotics and opiate problem in the US. It does seem to be, like this documentary, Eamon, pinned it hugely on the pharmaceutical industry and the prescribing patterns of doctors in the US. Is that something you've had any insight or?
Yeah, I mean, just what's the evolution of that whole crisis is very interesting, and the pharmaceutical industry did seem to aggressively target doctors in relation to pain medication and setting up pain clinics, and it led to huge prescribing of prescription opioids, and then people became addicted to them. And by the time the regulatory authorities really got a handle on it or started to impose restrictions, lots of people were addicted. So all the regulations then came in place, and people thought, well, that's going to sort out the problem. And what happened then was that people who had been addicted to the prescription opioids then moved to the illicit market. And that's where I was talking about earlier, the emergence of the synthetic fentanyls. And that swept across the country, associated with all these overdose deaths. I think that in British Columbia, in Canada, the information from there in relation to the opioid deaths is staggering. When you see the deaths associated with the fentanyl derivatives, that it just took off within a 2-year period to unprecedented levels, and it led to great difficulties for the service there, which had been it was the first service in Canada to provide a supervised injecting facility in Vancouver, and that had been going well. And suddenly they started checking then for the drugs that people were bringing in, just as interest. They would take a piece and check it. About 85% of them were fentanyl derivatives as opposed to being heroin. So it shows you how quickly that took over the market. And then it's spread into the community so much that they ended up having queues outside the supervised injecting facility, and people were hardly waiting until they got inside the supervised injecting facility. They were collapsing on the street, and staff were having to come out and resuscitate people on the street. So the fentanyl epidemic, and I know a bit about the background of the pharmacist, even though I haven't seen it. It has destroyed swathes of America. Louis Theroux, it's not quite the same, has got a very interesting program on Huntington in West Virginia, in one of his altered states programs. It's well worth a watch. And it's estimated that a huge amount of the population, I think up to a quarter of the population of this small town, were addicted to opioids, and the ambulance was just doing constant call-outs for overdoses. So that's a huge health problem in the States.
And can I ask, is it to do with the governance of advertisements, or the governance of prescribers, or what is the real difference with?
Well, I think when it started, it was in relation to the lax laws around that, but then when they tightened up, it became an illicit market. So now it's they're coming in all the different ways that I would have spoken about earlier, that drugs come into a market.
So there's another question here, Eamon, that's saying that cartels sometimes channel their contacts to make a seizure happen and suffer a short-term loss, but then it might have a long-term benefit for the bigger market. Any views in reality if that happens?
Yeah, we had a heroin drought here in about 2010, and that at the time then cocaine was being pushed to people, and we were wondering, was that associated with that type of practice where one gang held back the drugs in order to introduce a new substance in. But what had happened was that some of the warehouses in Afghanistan had flooded, and all the heroin there was contaminated, so it did lead to a reduction. I think the European market is so big that it's difficult to make that claim now in relation to a cartel, but some of the states in America that could definitely happen.
Wow.
They can do anything. It's crazy.
And how come Ireland is producing so much cannabis? Like, where are all of these grass houses and greenhouses? Or
well, I don't know. I mean, if I knew that, I'd be in the police.
Okay, fair enough. Stupid question, Katrina. Okay. You just seem to know so much about it, Eamon.
Yeah.
And the way, I just thought.
Yeah,
perhaps.
well, I obviously can't say it on a webinar that's been recorded, Katrina, My goodness.
Okay, yes, this would be the naive Katrina again. I know, a lot of people say to me, God, you're so green, Katrina. Okay. Somebody said it's actually because Ireland's so green. Okay. What was interesting was the drift of the prescriber from the pediatrician to a prescription mill. Yeah, the pharmacist talks a lot about, it deals a lot with a prescription mill. And I thought it was very interesting that they actually eventually interviewed the doctor that was, just what would you call it? I went through a discipline and was put through fitness to practice based on that. It was interesting to see her. Okay, on the issue of overdose in the north during COVID, some charities are training on naloxone use through webinars and posting it to the participants. Is there anything similar in Republic of Ireland?
Norma, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so there are some virtual training being carried out. We did a few weeks ago with the prison service. and that worked very well. Particularly worked in the prison service because they are very experienced in dealing with overdose. Something it happens routinely, whereas actually, funnily enough, in some of the clinics, overdose is pretty rare. Overdose is more common in hospitals and places like that. I suppose it comes on a need. A lot of the places are trained already. We had a look at where there were gaps. We put a call out, and we have a diary filling up of with my colleague Tim Mingham to do virtual training. That's happening week on week, and it's working out very well. Of course, with any webinar, there are pros and cons of the type of training. But given that this is the best we can do at the moment, it is working well. As we mentioned last week, there are some issues in terms of the actual training content and rescue breaths and CPR and all of that, but that's something that will be worked out. The chat question came up about posting out in a lock zone. It's a slightly different setup here. It has to be prescribed, but it is sent to GPs and they will give it directly to the patient. So it's not something that's necessarily a barrier to patients getting the treatment once the GP has it and can give it to them.
When you said there about posting, just for people's interests, in that there were different approaches across Europe, but in France, they took to posting the methadone OST, buprenorphine out to people's houses just in the regular post.
Oh. Okay.
Interesting.
Interesting. Somebody is saying that they are... somebody's interested in getting more hands-on experience. So many people are saying it was a fantastic webinar, by the way, and they really enjoyed the content, and lots of compliments. We'll send you the comment box afterwards so that you can revel in a moment of glory before you go off and do your daily work again. But it's always nice to get that little boost. Are there any particular bodies to volunteer with, or do the HSE take on pharmacists to work in this area? Norma?
Yeah, so a couple of different things. HSE and recruitment, we all know what that looks like, pretty slow. So in terms of outside of Dublin, there's just me in the HSE addiction service. And in Dublin, there are pharmacists in each clinic, but I don't think there's a need for volunteer necessarily within your own profession, but certainly if it's something that you want to, just generally give a hand with. There's loads of non-governmental agencies always looking for volunteers. In fact, I know for during COVID, they're struggling. For example, there's only one centre open in Limerick. They're feeding up to 200 people a day now and can't manage it at the weekend. They're closed because their volunteers usually would be elderly or people with a little bit more free time in their hands and that, and they are now cocooning and can't man the stations. So they're that kind of thing is definitely something that if you want to give your time to. But there isn't, I suppose it's so heavily regulated, there isn't kind of a volunteer to give up your time as a professional.
Okay, right. I think we'll leave it there if that's okay. Just to demonstrate my greenness, Norma and Eamon, an anecdote from my first year in college when I came to Dublin was walking up at the tender age of 17 up O'Connell Street and turned to the guy beside me, a classmate, saying, God, I heard Dublin was full of drugs and that O'Connell Street was rife with them, and sure, I don't see anything. And I was informed that I had been offered drugs 5 times from between the top and bottom of O'Connell Street, and I just was completely unaware. I thought people were being friendly. So yeah, I don't know if I'd last long in your line of business. But thank you very much for a wonderful presentation again. I'm sure you don't mind if we pass on your details if anybody has any further questions. But it's been a real pleasure to get an insight into your working area, and thank you on behalf of all of us for the work that you do. That's so greatly needed in our society and so valuable. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Katrina. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Good evening, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye-bye.